Everybody. So welcome back to Lifespan Development. So this is chapter 2, module 4. So we're going to be looking at cognitive theories and how they relate to lifespan development. All right. So here we go. This over here. And there we go. Okay. So what are cognitive theories? So cognitive theories emphasize mental aspects of development, such as logic and memory. So just a little refresher, we've talked about the different modern theories or the different schools of thought that pertain to developmental psychology. And so when we talked about the biological perspective, I know I'm kind of doing review here, but when you think of key terms, you can think of genes, hormones, nervous system. When you think of the evolutionary perspective, you're thinking about key term like evolution. From the psychoanalytic perspective, you're looking at unconscious motives and drives. When we talk about the humanistic perspective, we're looking at kind of that full potential and basic needs. And then with the cognitive learning perspective, like how we can modify and change behavior. And then with the cognitive theory, we're looking at like logic, memory, language. So all of those are the key words that I would try to remember when you're trying to learn and kind of relate these theories. So this semester, we're going to talk about the cognitive theory a lot. And the main theorist that we will be focusing on when it comes to this theory is Piaget. So Piaget focused on answering the central question of how does thinking develop? So he based many of his ideas about the consistent changes during childhood on naturalistic observation of children from different ages. So he was really trying to understand and study how from when an infant until late childhood, how does their thinking change? How does their perception of the world change? How do they acquire language? How does language impact logical and then also like hypothetical thinking? So that's what his theory focused on. So Piaget's theory is considered a cognitive developmental theory. So Piaget developed what he called was a scheme. So schemes are an internal cognitive structure that provides an individual with a procedure to follow in a specific circumstance. So we develop schemes for all different types of thinking and relating to the world. So it's just really an internal structure, it's a procedure on how we can kind of relate to something. So we have different schemes for different skills and language and all those types of things. So individuals begin with a small repertoire of sensory motor schemes, such as looking, tasting, touching, hearing, and reaching. So when you think of a very young newborn baby, so they kind of are in that like little newborn stage. I love that state where they're like all tucked up and they're just tiny. Really, a newborn baby is quite limited. So their ability to relate to the world is really just contained to their immediate present. So a baby might be able to suck on something only if you put it in their mouth, right? So a newborn's not going to have the motor skills and the schemes developed to be able to reach, grab something, and then put like their soother in their mouth. But obviously these things change and develop as they progress. So Piaget's theory, we're going to go through each one of the stages in his theory. I'm going to move myself over here. I'm frozen. Why is oops. Oh no. Okay. There we go. Just move myself over here. Go back. I'm still in the way. My computer doesn't want to cooperate today. Sorry. Just have to block some of the slides. Okay, so back to his 4 stages of development. So Piaget's first stage, he coined the sensory motor stage. So this was birth to 18 months. And when you think about young babies, like a newborn through to an 18-month-old, so my baby's at the very end of this stage, what do they always do? So if you gave a baby an object, especially a young baby, they're going to put it in their mouth, right? And so That is part of Piaget's sensory motor stage. So he believed that babies understand the world through their senses and their motor actions. So they begin to use symbols such as single words and pretend play near the end of this period. So babies are learning and exploring their environment really heavily based on their sensory skills. And one of the main sensory skills that they're using is through like taste and texture, right? So they put everything into their mouths. And even Lucren, so he's 18 months, he is using single words. And he also, we're going to talk about language development, but he will point to something and use a word, and he's generalized his speech. So if he sees a bird, every single bird that he sees is a duck. And everything that moves is a truck. So if he sees like a tractor driving down the road, he's going to say that that's a truck. So that's the stage that he's in. 18 months to 6 years is the pre-operational stage, according to Piaget. So by age 2, children can use symbols to both think and communicate. He develops the abilities to take others' points of views and classifies objects using simple logic by the end of this stage. So children at this stage are really being able, their critical thinking skills are taking like pretty substantial leaps forward, and their communication vastly improves. So if I think about the difference in communication between my 18-month-old and my 3-year-old, and hopefully currently my microphone's broken on my phone, but I'm working on getting a new one. And I'll maybe potentially do a couple Instagram stories of my kids so you can see the difference. But my 18-month-old is using single words. My 3-year-old is talking he never stops talking, and he's very good at communicating. And you also see the logic in his brain and how, like, what he's trying to understand. So I have a close family member that has been diagnosed with a fairly serious illness. And Micah said to me the other day, he goes, well, why is he sick? And I was like, honey, I don't have an answer for that. And he goes, did he forget to wear his mask when he went into the grocery store? And we've kind of explained masks a little bit to him, but like we don't talk about it all that often. But you can see that like he's trying to make logical connections with what's going on in his environment. So it's kind of a simple logic that's taking place. 6 to 12 is deemed the concrete operational stage. So this is when logic takes huge leaps forward. Children can understand conservation, which we're going to talk about what that means. So the idea that if you gave, actually, being like a mom here, I have Play-Doh in my home office. So the idea of conservation. So if you asked a child, if you took Play-Doh here, get my little experiment going. It's really sticky Play-Doh. All right. So if you take 2 balls that are roughly about the same size, like so, and say like these, if you can see them, I'm going to make myself a little bit bigger here. Okay. All right. So you can see these 2 balls of Play-Doh, roughly about the same size. If you asked a young child in the pre-operational stage, are these the same size? They would be able to probably tell you yes, right? Okay, so then if you take one and you make it bigger, like this, hold on. Or not make it bigger, sorry, you roll it out, change the shape. And then you ask them, are these 2 the same amount? Even though they've seen that you just changed this one, a child might say that this one has more Play-Doh, even though they watched you just change the shape. Whereas a child in the concrete operational stage, they've developed the term conservation. So they know that this is the same amount of Play-Doh. You've just changed the way it appears. So that's the idea of conservation, right? So then if you rolled it back, a young child in the pre-operational stage would be like, okay, no, now that's the same amount. But in the concrete operational stage, children would understand the term conservation, which means that they know that these were always the same. They didn't change. Okay. My little Play-Doh experiments here. Okay, so I'm going to make myself smaller again. Here we go. All right, so, oops. And then the last stage, what is going on here? Sorry. In the way. Face is in the way. Okay. All right. last stage in Piaget's theory is what he deemed the formal operational stage. And this is when children begin to be able to manipulate ideas. They start thinking hypothetically, and by adulthood, they can easily manage the what if, and their organizational skills have improved, things like that. So when you think about like the hypothetical questions, like if you just kind of that outside of the box thinking, right? So that's really what we need to be able to address some of the huge issues that are happening in society at this time. We need people that are hypothetical thinkers and outside of the box and kind of trying to draw different solutions to problems. And so Piaget would say that that type of thinking begins after the age of 12. All right, so another cognitive theory that we're going to talk about is the information processing theory. So this information processing theorists use almost a computer as a model when thinking about memory processes. So memory, if you've taken an introduction to psychology course before, you've probably learned a little bit about memory. So for those of you who are completely new to this, they believe that memory happens in three sub-processes that occur for memory to happen. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to encode the information. So you're organizing the information to be stored into memory. So if you think about even just what we've talked about so far in the course, we've gone through what the definition of psychology is. We've looked at what the 4 goals of psychology are. We've talked about research methods. We've talked about ethics. We've talked about the historical theories. Now we're on to current theory. So this is all within the first 2 weeks. So you are essentially being just and this is just one class. You have multiple other classes. So what you have to do to be able to remember the information is to be able to encode it. So you have to organize that information to be able to be stored into memory. So depending on how the outcome, so when we measure outcomes of memory for the purposes of school, you're usually doing that through a test or an assignment. So if, say, you're studying really hard, but you aren't doing very well, maybe you aren't encoding that information properly, or maybe you're not encoding it efficiently. So depending on how you encode the information is going to directly impact your ability to retrieve it. So storage is just keeping the information. So we have different memory systems. So we have short-term memory. So you're holding that information for a short amount of time. And then we have long-term memory. So ideally, what you're learning in school right now, you're going to store in your long-term memory so that you're able to use this as you move into your career path. And then retrieval is just the process of getting it out of your memory. So sometimes there can be issues in each one of those steps, which is why we don't remember certain information. One of my big tips for people is that when you are trying to remember something, you're trying to learn something, it's encoding it by making examples and thinking about how it relates to your life, and thinking of your own examples is a really helpful way to be able to make deeper connections, which is going to help you be able to retrieve that information more readily. So they taught this, this chart breaks down. So first we have our sensory memory. So that's just the information that's picked up by our senses. So when you think about blinking, how many people are aware that they've been blinking this entire time? You probably have not been thinking about blinking. However, when you close your eyes, technically, you would see blank. You see nothing. But our sensory memory holds the visual information just long enough so that we don't see black every time we blink. Then we take our information from our sensory memory to our short-term memory. And depending on how we encode that information, it can move to long-term memory, which is over. Why am I still moving around? Which is over here. I think that this is the last. Oh, no. So we have 2 more cognitive theories that we're going to talk about. So we have Vygotsky's social cognitive theory. So he asserted that complex forms of thinking have their origins in social interactions. So when we think about learning theories, we have this idea that you're just depending on the rewards or benefits or punishment, or how the associations we make, that's going to impact how children learn. But we know that that's not necessarily the case. So children also learn through social interactions in their environment, right? So they learn through adults. So children can learn new cognitive skills when they're guided by an adult through a process called scaffolding. So scaffolding is this idea that you are structuring an activity in a sense that you're allowed, like a child can't do that quite on their own, but they can do that with the assistance of an adult. So I'll use the example of riding a bike. So my son, my 3-year-old, is learning how to ride a bike. Okay. So the first little bit when he still has training wheels on, so he doesn't have the balancing part yet, but that's all part of scaffolding. So he cannot ride a 2-wheeler bike yet, but he can ride one with training wheels. But when he first got the bike, he had to like practice the movement of the pedals, but his legs weren't quite strong enough to be able to push the bike himself. So you saw me running down the road behind him, pushing him while he's like trying to pedal the bike. Now he can pedal the bike, but so he has a little bit of issues getting started. So you have to give him just a little gentle nudge to like help him get started. And now he can pedal. And I'm guessing by like the next couple summers, he's going to learn how to ride a 2-wheeler, and you'll see me holding him, helping him balance, and then him learning. So that's the idea of scaffolding. So he can't quite do it on his own. So we structure an activity with assistance so that that child can eventually do that. So they're learning how to do it. So what Vygotsky believed was that you need to work in a child's zone of proximal development. So this means that you're working on a task that's too hard to do on their own, but they can manage with guidance. So I'll give the example of reading. All right. So say a child is learning how to read. My background was was in elementary school. So that's what I did my reading. I have like my reading certifications and also my special education certifications as well. So when we're looking at helping a child who potentially is struggling to read, when they're reading on their own, I always use the 5-word rule. So if a child opens, so this was like around grade 4, if a child in grade 4 opens a book, and there's 5 words on any given page that they can't read, we would say that that book is too hard for them, right? So in the classroom, you would have leveled books. And so you'd say you need to level down because that book is too difficult. So that would mean that that child's going to struggle with reading comprehension. However, when I'm working, so I was a literacy coach for some time. When I was working one-on-one with a child, I would want them to pick a book that there were 5 words that they were struggling to read. So when they're reading independently, you wouldn't want them to do that. But the zone of proximal development would say that you want a child to, when you're helping them, to be working just above their current level, right? Because you're going to push them to the next level by scaffolding and by working with them one-on-one. So that's what the zone of proximal development is. The last cognitive theory that we're going to talk about is Bandura. So Bandura believed that children learned through what was called observational learning or modeling. So one of my examples of observation, I have so many examples now that I have my own children, the other day, so my husband was working out in the garage, and my son loves to go help his dad. So he's out there and he's working on his snowmobile, and he's holding a light and he's fixing things. My son comes in, he goes downstairs into his toy room, and he gets out his truck, and he has a hammer, and then he has a flashlight, and he's holding the flashlight and he's banging on the truck. And I was like, what are you doing? He goes, I'm fixing, Mommy, I'm fixing. And so he's modeling exactly what he had seen. And so that's an example of observational learning or modeling. So children will often model what they see. And sometimes it kind of can be a little bit, in a way, as a parent, a little bit scary because you realize how you sound. So my 3-year-old will put my 18-month-old in timeout, and he'll be like, that was bad. You have to sit in timeout, right? So it's that idea that children are always watching, and they're modeling, and they're learning through that process. And so Bandura developed what he called reciprocal determinism. So this is human development is based on personal factors, behavioral factors, and environmental factors. So all of those things are going to interact together to influence outcomes. And so one of the questions that I'm going to have in the in-class activity today is we're going to talk about how I'm going to get you to talk about why, based on this theory, so through observational learning. And there's going to be a video. I'm going to embed a video for you to watch on Bandura's theory. So he studied what was called a Bobo doll experiment. And so once you watch that video, you'll understand that better. But the idea that if children are learning through just watching, what could be the outcomes of watching violent TV or violent video games? Would that make somebody then act more violently? And really, it's going to boil down to reciprocal determinism. So we all have personal factors that are going to influence our learning. So you might have somebody that's maybe more prone to be aggressive than others. You might have behavioral factors in place as well, and their environment. So what kind of environment are they in, and what are they picking up on? So that is it for this is just breaking that down. So we have behavioral, you're learning to play soccer. Environmental factor to influence that behavior would be that your friends may also play soccer. And personal would be the idea that you are personally fit and like to participate in team activities. So that is the idea that all three of those things are going to work together to influence behavior. So that's it for the content for chapter 2. I will be embedding a few videos to try to help reinforce these theories. So I'll find some YouTube videos and post them as well. So if you have any questions, please make sure that you're bringing those to our live team sessions. Have a great day, everybody.